Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of A Game in a Chair, brought to you by the American Civil War Gaming Club. For more information on our club, you can go to acwgc.net. There you'll find our homepage and a lot of information about the types of games that we play and just who we are. I am Blake. I am the host here on A Game and a Chair, and in this episode, we're going to start a new feature called Beyond the Pixels. In this series, I want to look at the lesser-known commanders and units that we run across in the WDS Civil War series. When I began to play these games back in the 90s when I was in high school, it was very common for me to see leaders that I had never heard of before, and to discover units, same thing, that I had never heard of. And I often wondered just where these units came from, what their backstory was, and who these commanders were. And I wanted to find out more, and that would eventually lead me to reading much more Civil War history and expanding my realm of knowledge. And I kind of wanted to share some of that with you, and still today I have to research some of these units and commanders because obviously the Civil War is so large that you could never know everything. And that's what I wanted to really concentrate on here, just to have some fun, look at the story behind these units, and beyond the pixels. So, we are going to begin with the Battle of First Bull Run. I have no real reason to start here, but I remember years ago always being amazed at one thing with the Battle of First Bull Run. And perhaps you were as well when you first played it. And that is Bonham's Brigade. So we're going to take a closer look at Bonham's Brigade at the Battle of First Bull Run, because it is large. It is located just down south of Mitchell's Ford and contains 6 regiments of men, mostly from South Carolina, but also from North Carolina and Louisiana. And again, this is the first Bull Run scenario, and altogether, this brigade fields 4,383 men. As a Confederate, you're probably looking at that total and salivating, because 2 or 3 years down the road in the Civil War, 4,300 men, that's practically the size of a division. So to see a single brigade in a single battle have that many men really kind of makes you wonder, what is the backstory? How does this even happen? And who the heck is Bonham? Because I'd never heard of him before this. And you hardly ever hear of him after this battle. So let's get the backstory. We're going to start by talking about the leader of the brigade, Millage Bonham. He was born in South Carolina in 1813 and was the younger brother of James Bonham. If that name sounds a bit familiar, it probably should. James Bonham was one of the defenders of the Alamo in 1836. And ever since then, he has been portrayed in countless films, most notably probably by John Wayne's son, Patrick Wayne, in the 1960 film The Alamo. It's a small world, right? I mean, how do you get from James Bonham to Millage Bonham to Patrick Wayne to John Wayne? Well, there you go. So, let's get back to actual history. Millage Bonham would graduate from South Carolina College, later the University of South Carolina, in 1834 and become a lawyer. He was active in the South Carolina State Militia and would serve without really seeing any action in both the Seminole Wars and the Mexican-American War. He would also later serve in the state legislature of South Carolina. In 1857, he succeeded his cousin, Preston Smith Brooks, as a Democratic representative from South Carolina to the United States Congress. You might remember Preston Brooks as well. It was Brooks that gave Charles Sumner quite the beating on the floor of the Senate in 1856. In December of 1860, along with the other South Carolina representatives, he resigned from Congress after South Carolina seceded from the Union. Bonham was appointed a major general and the leader of the Army of South Carolina by Governor Francis Pickens in February of 1861. He agreed to serve under Pierre Beauregard, who was in the service of the Confederate States Army itself during the Fort Sumter crisis. He then joined the actual Confederate States Army soon afterward and was made a brigadier general. Bonham would command the South Carolina Brigade sent to Virginia by Governor Pickens. At first, the South Carolina Brigade consisted of the 1st, 2nd, 7th, and 8th South Carolina regiments. These units were all organized during the Fort Sumter crisis and were among the first to transfer to the regular Confederate service. The 1st South Carolina, though, would leave Virginia in April once its enlistments were up and would be replaced by the 3rd South Carolina. Colonel Joseph Kershaw commanded the 2nd South Carolina Regiment at 1st Manassas, and also joining the brigade would be the 11th North Carolina. The 11th North Carolina would arrive just days before the actual start of the Battle of Manassas. In command was Colonel William Kirkland, a former U.S. Marine who had attended West Point. The regiment would later become the 21st North Carolina and serve with the Army of Northern Virginia throughout the war. They were one of only 2 North Carolina regiments who could say that they had fought in every battle the Army of Northern Virginia fought from Manassas to Appomattox, the other regiment being the 6th North Carolina. Also joining the brigade would be 6 companies of the 8th Louisiana. After the Manassas campaign, the Louisiana Regiment would transfer to an all-Louisiana brigade and serve with Ewell's division in the Shenandoah Valley. Once in Virginia, Bonham would briefly command the Confederate forces defending the Bull Run until Pierre Beauregard, called to Virginia by President Jefferson Davis, arrived in late May 1861. Bonham would later claim to be the first general officer to take the field in Virginia, and I guess technically that's true. It was likely because of this, and the fact that he did lead a brigade on the Bull Run itself, that Beauregard appointed that brigade the 1st Brigade in the newly formed Army of the Potomac. So how did Bonham perform in his role as the commander of the 1st Brigade in the Army of the Potomac? According to one of James Longstreet's aides, Bonham was totally unfit for a military leader. Bonham's brigade held Beauregard's forward position at Fairfax Courthouse before the Battle of Manassas. Once General McDowell's Union Army began their advance, Bonham poorly managed his brigade's retreat to Centreville and nearly caused a disaster by waiting too long to fall back. Although bound to withdraw to Centreville as soon as he drew the enemy's fire and gained some appreciation of his size, Bonham had told Beauregard that he preferred to fight it out as long as possible in his forward position. But the South Carolinian, according to another, all the time appeared very much flurried. After moving his troops around and making some demonstrations as if for a fight, he ordered a retreat, which ought to have been done before the enemy was so close. As a consequence, wrote one of his men, everything was done very hurriedly, and a considerable amount of property was left behind, consisting of provisions, forage, tents, some guns, and ammunition. From the number of canteens, knapsacks, blankets, and such, which our men threw away on the road, our retreat no doubt appeared more like a rout. Before the Battle of First Bull Run, it was planned that Bonham's brigade was to be part of Beauregard's attack across the Bull Run itself, and therefore he held a position south of Mitchell's Ford. On July 21st, when the actual Battle of Manassas began, the battle developed in a wholly unanticipated way for General Beauregard, and the fighting actually occurred further to the west at the Stone Bridge and Henry House Hill area. Bonham's brigade, therefore, spent the first part of the day inactive at Mitchell's Ford. Eventually, Kershaw, along with the 2nd South Carolina and the 8th South Carolina, would be sent to Henry Hill by Joseph Johnston in the afternoon and play a large role in the events which unfolded there. As for Bonham at Mitchell's Ford, his day was not quite over yet either. Johnston would order Bonham, with the part of his brigade not dispatched with Kershaw to the other flank, and Longstreet's brigade, to pursue the Federals and strike them at Centreville. Bonham, as the senior officer, took command of both brigades. "We set out in a double-quick time with a shot at every step," wrote one of Bonham's officers, "and we went up to the ground where the enemy's guns had been planted and from where they had been shooting at us all day. But they had made good their escape, with the exception of a few poor fellows, who I supposed were scared too bad to run and who we made prisoners." But this is where Bonham's story at Manassas turns pretty tragic for the Southern cause. A false report of a Union counterattack beyond the Confederate right flank stunned Bonham into indecision. The Confederate artillery with Bonham was preparing to shell the retreating Federals at Centreville when Bonham ordered them to limber back up and begin the retreat back to the Bull Run. Despite strong arguments from Longstreet that the Federals were in full retreat, Bonham would not change his orders. As it turned out, all these rumors of a Federal counterattack were completely baseless. Nonetheless, Bonham chose to retreat. According to Longstreet's aide Moxley Sorrell, Longstreet did not acquiesce with a quiet sigh, but flew into a fine rage. He dashed his hat furiously on the ground, stamped, and bitter words escaped him. The two brigades would fall back over the Bull Run and sleep on their arms the balance of the night as the Federals retreated safely back to Washington, D.C. According to one of Bonham's aides, Bonham could not realize that the enemy was so completely routed and disorganized, while Longstreet knew from experience how utterly impossible it was to rally a demoralized army. But Bonham, being a civilian and politician, simply could not understand it. So, what would become of Bonham after First Manassas? He never appears in any of the other WDS games and only makes an appearance in the first Bull Run scenario. Well, it was probably obvious to many people, and probably to Bonham as well, that he was not fit for a military command. In January of 1862, he would resign his commission and join the Confederate Congress as a representative from South Carolina. In 1862, he would be elected as the governor of South Carolina and hold that post until December of 1864. When the war ended, he returned to state politics and held a number of political posts before his death in 1890. As for some of his subordinates at Manassas, their careers were just beginning in the Confederate Army. The commander of the 2nd South Carolina, Joseph Kershaw, would go on to participate in nearly every battle the Army of Northern Virginia fought during the Civil War. He would take over the command of the brigade after Bonham's departure, and it would soon become better known as Kershaw's South Carolina Brigade. Kershaw would rise to the rank of Major General and be captured at the Battle of Sailor's Creek in April of 1865. He became a judge on the Circuit Court of South Carolina after the war and died in 1894. Colonel William Kirkland of the 11th North Carolina would have an interesting career in the Confederate Army as well. He served in Jackson's Valley Campaign as the commander of the 11th North Carolina, later the 21st North Carolina, before being wounded at the First Battle of Winchester. While recuperating in Tennessee, he served as Patrick Cleburne's chief of staff during the Murfreesboro Campaign and was at the Battle of Stones River. He returned to the east and fought through the Gettysburg Campaign and eventually commanded a brigade in Lee's army. He was wounded numerous times in the war and eventually ended up in North Carolina, where he fought with Johnston's army at Bentonville and surrendered with them in April of 1865. He was the only former U.S. Marine to serve as a Confederate general during the Civil War. He would live until 1915 when he died at the age of 82. For the enlisted men of Bonham's brigade, their war had also just begun. The 11th North Carolina and 8th Louisiana would soon be transferred to other units, and the brigade was soon an all-South Carolina unit. The brigade would fight in nearly all of the battles of the Army of Northern Virginia, as well as taking part in the Chickamauga Campaign and the Knoxville campaigns with Longstreet in 1863. The brigade would not finish its career with the Army of Northern Virginia, though. They would be sent to the Carolinas in January of 1865 and would fight their last battle at Bentonville with Johnston's forces. They would surrender there on April 26, 1865. So the next time you play First Bull Run and you see Bonham's large brigade sitting south of Mitchell's Ford, you know the full story beyond the pixels. I hope you guys have enjoyed this video here. Like I said, I just kind of wanted to give you some of the backstory behind some of these units that are pretty unique in the WDS series and some of these generals who almost just make a cameo in some of these games. I've always found it interesting to learn the unit histories and just to know more about Civil War history itself. Alright, thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a like on here. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel. When you do that, you will get notifications when new videos are posted, so you can watch them all and keep up to date on everything American Civil War Gaming Club. Thank you once again for watching, and until the next time, just keep gaming.